Today on the show, the first weekend of the NFL playoffs are in the books, and of course, the Seahawks were not involved in them. I'll give you my thoughts on the season, how it ended, get you caught up on some news. We know that Carolyn Schneider will be back for 2022, but Ken Norton Jr. will not. The defensive coordinator fired today. My thoughts on that, and reading the tea leaves on what direction Carroll plans to take with that spot moving forward. It may surprise you. And whether Russell Wilson. Yep, here we go again. What are the odds he returns for another year? There's already a bunch of chatter. I'll put a number on what I think the odds are for that. Stay tuned. Episode 29 of the ECS is up next. Welcome back to the show, everybody. Just having some fun. If those of you who listened to the last episode know that we had some technical difficulties here in the Dan Cave Studios. My trusty Rodecaster Pro mixer just died 13, 14 months into it, just completely died. Sent it back to the warehouse to get fixed. They determined they could not fix it, so they sent me a new one. So a little reprogramming and maybe a little rusty working the buttons today. But just wanted to hop on before we really get into the proper off season here in a few weeks and start looking ahead to the combine, which appears to be moving forward this year as opposed to last year. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully they can have a true combine, and then we'll get you ready for the draft, and we'll get into free agency and all that. We'll get all your favorite guests back on the show to take some deep dives into what we think the Seahawks are going to do this offseason. Part of it began to take shape today, and we'll get into that in just a moment. First, just to put a bow on things, the Seahawks finished 7-10 in their first ever 17-game season. Of course, lost 7 of 8 in one stretch during part of that time. Of course, Russell Wilson out with the finger injury. Rebounded to win 4 of 6 down the stretch. Yes, 2 of those wins were against terrible teams, but 2 were also against some pretty darn good playoff teams, not the least of which is the San Francisco 49ers, who looked great in week 1. The Arizona Cardinals did not. They are out. Overall, the offense looked a lot better in the last 2 games. Looked like Russell was finally healthy. Looked like he found a rhythm. Looked like he and Shane Waldron kind of clicked with that new offense. It's kind of how we thought it was going to look all year. It finally looked in those last couple of games. A lot of that was due to Rashad Penny. Gave the team a running threat. He was the best running back in the league over the last 5-6 games, statistically. Made life easier on Russell. Defense kind of did what they did the whole second half of the season. Solid in the red zone. Scoring average was solid. Top 10-ish in scoring defense in the league, but near last in yards. That took a heavy toll, as we'll talk about in a minute. The big question is, or was, still is, was the final 6 games an anomaly? Was the 7-10 season, the 7-10 record, an anomaly? Was it more due to Russ's injury and the lack of continuity that caused? And then coming back before he was 100% healty and having to try to adjust to that, play through that. We talked about it last time. Lots of close losses. 8 of the 10 losses by 10 points or less. 5 of those by 3 points or less. So the big question is, how far is this team away from being a contender again? And certainly, if we were to have this conversation 8 weeks ago, might have been much, much different. In fact, there were reports that Jody Allen wasn't happy with how things were going in the organization, didn't see it as a one-year blip, that maybe there were some changes in store, lots of speculation about Pete Carroll's future, John Schneider's future, and a big meeting that was going to happen last week between them and Jody Allen, who obviously runs the trust left behind by Paul Allen when he died in 2018. No big news to come out of that meeting at all, other than status quo. They're going to keep the band together and run it back again in 2022. Today, I'm going to give you my thoughts on how sound I think that decision was, whether it was the right one, and kind of what comes next. set the stage. And then again, we'll dig into that more over the next few weeks. The big question is, how far away is this team from, however you want to phrase it, from being a contender again, from being good again, if you want to really generalize. Clearly, Jody Allen doesn't think that they're that far away. Bringing Pete Carroll back again, keeping the front office intact. Because the conjecture, the speculation out there, the theories ran the gamut. From Carroll walking away, to Carroll being fired, to Schneider being fired and Carroll staying, to Carroll being stripped of his personnel duties and giving Schneider more authority. And it kind of were all over the place with the reports. Ultimately, it sounds like things are going to stay intact. And we may not be privy to some of the organizational machinations behind the scenes. There may be some changes in who answers to who, or how things are done behind the scenes. But as far as who's running the show, doesn't change at all. With one exception. As I said at the top of the show, Ken Norton Jr. out as defensive coordinator today after running the defense for 4 years and after years and years and years of being with Pete Carroll as a player, as an assistant coach, then as a defensive coordinator. Out after 4 years, along with passing game coordinator Andre Curtis. Both those gentlemen let go today. It doesn't sound like there will be any other big staff changes, or those likely would have been announced today as well. Although there's always a chance that whoever is hired as the defensive coordinator may want to make some changes of his own. Thoughts on Ken Norton Jr.? It's a big move because of those ties and that history that he and Carroll had. Carroll doesn't take these things lightly. He values those relationships and those friendships and those professional relationships. He nurtured, he developed Ken Norton Jr. as a coach. Certainly, I'm sure, wanted to see him succeed. But something had to change. Defense wasn't forcing turnovers at the rate that Carroll historically has liked. They were giving up far too many yards, not getting off the field on third down. And there were so many times that the defense had to shoulder so much more of the load when the offense was struggling. But it works the other way, too. That defense was on the field a long time because they couldn't get off the field on third downs. Put a lot more pressure on the offense sometimes to have to make things happen quickly. So was Norton a sacrificial lamb? You can make an argument, and some do, and some have today. But they shouldn't have fired him. That the progress we saw from that defense throughout the year, once they kind of settled on some things in the secondary, especially at the corner position, that they did about as well as they could do, given the talent on hand, given the lack of an elite pass rush. And once again, that was a little bit of a point of contention this year, that the pass rush just wasn't what we were hoping it would be. You can make an argument that he did the best with what he had. What we don't know, what we'll never know, is how much does Pete Carroll have his hands on the defense? We know he's a defensive guy. We know that for the most part, he's extremely involved in the scheming and game planning that happens on defense. It's an important question because when we start to consider who will take Ken Norton's place, do you go with a younger guy? I've seen some names tossed around already today, guys like Jared Mayo. Do you go with an older guy? A bunch of them were just let go. A lot of them are available right now. A lot of them just got fired as coaches. Vic Fangio, one of the great defensive coordinators probably the last 20 years, consistently. Do you go with an old dog like Mike Zimmer? Take him back to his roots. He's unlikely to get another head coaching job in this cycle. But this was interesting. Adam Jude on Twitter today saying that Carroll intends to get back to an attacking style. That's all it said. But I would assume that to mean more pressure, more blitzing, forcing turnovers, being a little more unpredictable. So it begs the question of, well, why couldn't you do that with Ken Norton Jr.? especially when you're kind of a guy calling the shots behind the curtain, right? So to me, the real question is Pete Carroll willing to hire an established defensive coordinator and cede some of that control and let them run more of the show, become more of a general manager type head coach? So many of the head coaches that he came up under were Bud Grant, George Seifert. Those were guys who delegated and let their assistants really dig in and do their thing. Are we at that point? If he's going to let one of his proteges go, one of his long-time assistants, then you would think that perhaps he's ready to make some changes. And we've seen it before in his career. Heck, his career was revitalized because of some changes he had made in his coaching style and how he ran his organization after he was let go by the Jets or by the Patriots and went back to USC. He vowed, if you've read his book, if you know anything about Pete Carroll, took a year away from coaching and completely outlined exactly how he wanted to approach coaching for the rest of his career. He's made some changes along the way. Is he willing to do that on defense? Well, maybe we're getting a hint. Two ends of the spectrum. The two known candidates today who have been named, one is Clint Hurt, defensive line coach. He's a guy in-house, guy who's never been a DC, the guy who's looking for his first shot. That seems to fit the Carroll mold, and that would imply that Carroll would still very much be involved and be a de facto defensive coordinator. And that's a debate for another day about whether that's a good thing. But the other candidate, Seahawks have asked permission to interview Ed Donatel from the Denver Broncos, Vic Fangio's defensive coordinator for the last few years. Longtime defensive coordinator in the league. He was with the Packers for many years. A guy with ties to Carroll from 30 years ago. And it was interesting. I saw somebody run a report out there today, or they brought up an old story 10 years ago where Carroll was it was a wide-ranging interview where he was being asked about his defensive philosophy. And he went into how important, this is back from his USC days, this story was. And he was talking about how important turnovers are, forcing turnovers to their program and what they want to accomplish. And he specifically cited what Ed Donatel was doing in Green Bay at that time. And he also cited Monty Kiffin, who we know how influential Monty Kiffin was on Carroll's scheme and how he coaches defense. So I thought that was interesting. Donatel's in his 60s now. Ed Donatel is likely at this point in his career not a guy who's going to take a job to be a figurehead. He'd probably get some pretty solid autonomy to run the defense the way he sees fit. But he and Carroll probably, for the most part, are on the same page because of their shared background. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think it'll really be interesting to see as well if Gus Bradley becomes a player in this game. Obviously, former defensive coordinator for the Seahawks, had great success here. Kind of put together that defense that ended up winning the Super Bowl, but that was the year. I believe that was the year, and I think Quinn took over the Super Bowl year, and Bradley went to Jacksonville, got the head coaching job there. When he was let go by Jacksonville in 2018, I went back and I remembered reading reports of interest then in bringing Bradley back to be defensive coordinator. Found him. There was an Ian Rappaport report from 2018 that the Seahawks indeed were interested in bringing Gus Bradley back, but at that time he chose to take the Chargers job, and that's when the Seahawks went and lured Norton away from the Raiders. Hired him as defensive coordinator 4 years ago. Gus Bradley, obviously now the defensive coordinator in Las Vegas for the Raiders. Well, they're looking for a new head coach. They may stick with the interim guy, but there's a question as to whether Gus Bradley will be relieved of his duties or not, depending on who they hire, who they decide to go with as head coach down there. That would obviously make a lot of sense to bring him back again. And then there's some chatter today about Chris Richard and bringing him back again, at least to run the passing game. Maybe give him an elevated title, assistant head coach, something like that. Pay him at the top end of that scale. Did a decent job as defensive coordinator here. But clearly, I think the reason Curtis was let go is part of this too. When you look at all the stats of this defense over the last 3 or 4 years, the glaring one, the one that really sticks out like a sore thumb, is passing yards allowed. And that led directly into third down efficiency and those kinds of things. So really interesting to see what will happen moving forward with defensive coordinator here. They'll probably want to move quickly, because as soon as there's 8 head coaching jobs open in the NFL, as soon as those jobs start to be filled, those guys are going to hire their defensive coordinators. And even what typically happens is those candidates start to put their staffs together ahead of time so that they can fill them quickly, or they'll align themselves with certain defensive coordinator candidates. And that's part of their pitch to their prospective team is, hey, here's my staff. So we'll see what happens. If Donatell's interested and that's the guy that they've targeted, it could very well be that moves quickly. It could very well be that was the plan that allowed them to let Norton go, and it could just be a short matter of time before Donatell is hired. Wouldn't surprise me at all. So the meeting with Allen, Carroll, and Schneider this week that resulted in nothing really, other than they all agreed to keep the thing together. Still a lot of people out there that are ready for change. And certainly when things were going as badly as they were earlier this season, I had my moments too. If I had been doing this show every week during the season, we would have been able to document the ups and downs. Because if you've listened to the show long enough, or you know me, you know that I embrace change, and change as a journalist or as someone who follows a team, in some ways is more fun. It's more fun to have covered the Mariners for the last 3 years with the change they made, the decision to tear down and rebuild, than it would have been if they had just tried to keep piecing it together each and every offseason as they had been doing. Change can be fun. It's scary, sure, but it can be fun because it's so much more interesting to talk about than the same old. And I think some fans are guilty of that too. Some of the fans out there who are crying for Carroll to be fired, wanting change, sometimes you just get tired with the status quo. But here's why it was the right move, in my opinion. And it was the obvious move. Because as bad as it looked in the middle of the season, losing 7 of 8, they reeled it back in. The way Carroll kept that roster together, kept that locker room together, got that team to play hard in meaningless games for the first time in years here in Seattle. Some of the players on this roster have never played in a meaningless game in December. Yet they went out and played hard. And they beat a couple good teams. They did some good things, and they took a step forward. I think especially on offense. It kind of would have been understandable for this team to essentially pack it in. But they didn't. And particularly on offense, really did some things and looked like things clicked with Shane Waldron. There were some real questions I had of myself mid-season about whether Waldron was in over his head, whether this was just a learning curve and a development period, or whether he just wasn't very intuitive about how to call a game. But those last couple of games, it sure seemed like he did, and that Russ bought into it. Russ got rid of the ball quicker in those last 2 weeks than I've seen him in a couple of years, and we've seen him. To me, that tells me that he and Waldron are on the same page. That's promising going into next year. But here's why it was the right decision to keep it together. We touched on some of this stuff a couple of weeks ago, but it's even more pronounced if you were to make a list of bullet points now, because the decision's been made to keep everything together. The roster is solid. You can argue all day, and I will, that it lacks a couple of dynamic impact players. Needs a couple more stars, a couple more difference makers. But the roster itself is solid. It's young. There's some key free agents to retain, but no more so, I don't think, than any other team in the NFL. But they have the tools and the resources to make that happen. first of all, they've created a culture players want to stay in. Quandre Diggs, Dwayne Brown, Sidney Jones, DJ Reed. Those guys want to stay. Rashad Penny's been very open about it. He wants to stay. Pay the Seahawks back for giving him a chance still in his fourth year after he had essentially been a bust for 3.5 seasons. So guys want to play here. And we've seen multiple cases over the last few years of the Seahawks allowing veteran players to go out into free agency, of not getting them locked up to a deal by the opening of the new league year in March. And then they get it back. Chris Carson's the best example of that. Everybody assumed Carson was going to leave last year and leave for better money than the Seahawks were willing to pay him. And he was out there in free agency for 2-3 weeks. Came back at a reasonable dollar. Wanted to be here. Would he have signed somewhere else if somebody blew him away? Absolutely, of course. And that'll happen if someone comes in and pays Quandre Diggs more than the Seahawks are willing to, then he'll move on. To me, the key players there are, I am in the camp that you absolutely have to bring Rashad Penny back. Now, that doesn't mean at any cost. But I think what you'll find, for those of you who are scared someone's going to overpay him and give him $8-9 million a year, look what Chris Carson got last year after testing free agency for weeks. Injury history, yes, but nowhere near as bad as Rashad Penny. Much better track record. No question about how effective a running back he is when he's healthy. Young, prime of his career. And he couldn't garner enough interest for the Seahawks to have to pay any more than 2 years, $9 million, $10 million. His cap hit, I think, this coming year. The first year cap hit was low. The second one's about $6.5 million. Kind of protected themselves against injury. There's a chance Chris Carson doesn't. There's a chance he gets cut if they don't think that neck injury is going to rebound. And the way they structured the contract, it's a pretty low cap hit if he is cut. Rashad Penny, much worse injury history, much more volatility, many more question marks. He had a great five-game stretch, but Carson has had similar stretches. I don't see Penny getting any more money than that. And seeing as how he wants to be back, he and Carson are best friends. I think a very similar contract gets it done. And I would do that 100 times out of 100. So I think he's key. Quandre Diggs is key, but free safeties are replaceable. And the role of the free safety is dictated so much by the scheme and who's calling the shots. Whether or not they bring Quandre Diggs back or are willing to pay him what he thinks he's worth on the free agent market, even coming back off the really significant ankle dislocation and broken leg, may be dictated by the defensive coordinator hire. We'll see. I think the two corners are essential. You got to lock DJ Reed up. And I would try to do that before free agency because somebody may overpay that dude. I may even use the transition tag and at least get yourself right of first refusal. And I'd bring back Sidney Jones. I thought Sidney Jones played really, really well the second half of the season once he got comfortable. Really kind of showed why he was a second-round pick. I think the PFF grades were kind to him as well. And I don't think he's going to be expensive to bring back at all. A guy who's had an injury history, who's been cut, played his college ball here, really kind of found a home. I think those guys are key. To me, the questionable one is Dwayne Brown. First half of last season looked old, broken down, tired, done. But second half of the season, he played pretty well. And people whose opinion of offensive line play that I trust say that he played pretty well. And he said he felt great at the end of the year. So he's going in the offseason healthy, or at least not as beaten up as he has been some other seasons. Healthy Dwayne Brown, if he's willing to do 1-year deals, or if he's willing to do one of those 2 or 3-year deals with a couple of void years on it to lower the first-year cap hit, I'd be open to bringing him back. But that is a spot that I would, as we get closer to free agency, depending on what they do and bringing some of these other guys back and manipulating their cap, I would explore every option. If you can upgrade left tackle with a slightly younger player with a little higher ceiling, I would look to do that. So those are really the key guys that I think you need to bring back. And for those of you who are saying, look, Seahawks have the 5th highest cap space in the league coming back next year, somewhere between $45 and $55 million, depending on which site you look at. Well, that's all going to be sucked up by bringing these guys back you just talked about. It's not how it works. It's not how it works. I hear that all the time. They're not going to have any money to go out and get impact players in free agency because they have to re-sign these other guys. You haven't been paying attention. Cap space isn't a hard, fast, black and white numbers game. It's about flexibility because a good cap guy, and Matt Thomas is one of the best in the league, can manipulate anything. We saw it last year. This front office is willing to be creative and use void years, which they weren't in the past. Is that a one-year thing coming out of COVID and the lower salary cap and all of that? Maybe. Maybe not. Because there are other reasons to believe that there's a window of opportunity in 2022 for them to be aggressive and go out. And you could sign a left tackle. You could get a Terran Armstead. You could go after, pay big-time money to Ryan Jensen, the all-pro center from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You could make a big splash like that and still bring these other guys back. You can do it all. Because look at it this way. Don't look at it as $55 million. And if Dwayne Brown gets 10, and then Jones gets 3, and then Reed gets 9, and then, it's all gone. Look at it as they have the 5th most flexibility of any team in the league. It's where they rank against other teams. They have more flexibility. Most of the teams ahead of them are bad teams. It's Jacksonville again. So they have all the flexibility in the world they need. Now, let's look at the draft. No first-round draft pick. We know that. Stop complaining about it. It's not coming back. Jamal Adams is on the roster. The first-round draft pick doesn't exist. But look at the draft board. There's still a benefit to having a poor season. Instead of drafting in the back 10% of every round, as they usually do, they're in the top third of every round now. So no first, but a high second, high third, 2 high fourths, because they got the Jets 4th and Jamal Adams in that trade. A high 6 or high 5th, no 6, and a high 7. I believe that's it. So it kind of looks like the way a draft board usually does when the Seahawks are drafting 24th or 25th, slide back a couple of spots, pick up an extra 4th. It doesn't look that different than what a typical John Schneider draft board looks like. So there's an opportunity to add impact in this draft still and some flexibility. With that extra 4th, there's even an opportunity to move up to aggressively go after a player that they like. Maybe this year they do that. They also play a last place schedule. This is one of the hidden benefits of finishing last in the NFC West. They play a last place schedule. And this is their second year playing 17 games. They played 9 road games last year. This is the year they get 9 home games. So in addition to the Cards, Niners, Rams, listen to this home schedule. Falcons, Panthers, Broncos, Raiders, Giants, Jets. Road schedule is a little tougher because of because they play the NFC South. So they play the Saints, the Bucks, and the Chiefs on the road, the Chargers on the road, and then the Lions on the road. But Jets, Giants, Lions, Raiders, Broncos, Panthers, Falcons, who knows how good the Saints will be. And then the division. Now let's talk about the division. The Rams are in for a little bit of a comeuppance. They have, I think I looked it up today, they have $9,000 in available cap space for 2022. So you're talking about, the Seahawks don't have enough cap space to make stuff happen. Would you rather have $50 million or $9,000? The Rams could very well win the Super Bowl this year. They better, because they may not be able to keep that roster together. Cardinals look like a mess. Faltered down the stretch. Kyler Murray looked like a shell of himself. I may have been right about Kyler Murray all along. I think he's a paper tiger. There's questions about Cliff Kingsbury. And Cards look like a mess. And the 49ers, as good as they've looked, it's well known in league circles that they're going to move on from Jimmy Garoppolo this offseason and hand the reins to Trey Lance next year. Now, he may be incredibly talented, but it's going to be his first year as a starter. And they're going to hand things over to him. So you look at that schedule and you look at those opponents in that home and away schedule. It's pretty easy to see 10, 11 wins there, minimum, if you bring back essentially the same group. So those are the reasons why you don't blow it up now. A lot of close losses this year, Russ being hurt, and then all that stuff we just talked about. Now, for those of you saying, well, I don't trust him in free agency, and I don't trust him in the draft. They've drafted like crap for the last 7 or 8 years. I saw that a bunch on Twitter yesterday. Not so fast. Go back and look at the 2020 draft. If you take away Stephen Sullivan, the tight end taken in the 7th round, they tried to make him into a wide receiver, then they tried to make him into a defensive end. Look at the rest of that draft. Jordan Brooks, Darrell Taylor, Damian Lewis, Colby Parkinson, showed some things in the last couple of games this year, finally right. DJ Dallas, Alton Robinson, Freddie Swain. That's a solid damn draft. That's 7 guys in 6 rounds that are key contributors on your team and young and cheap. Darrell Taylor looks to me like a budding star. So does Jordan Brooks. Damian Lewis struggled more on the left side. It'll be interesting to see if maybe they move him back to the right side next year. Parkinson looks like a weapon, and with Gerald Everett and Will Dissly, both free agents, could play a huge role in that tight end room next year. Alton Robinson, we've seen what he can do. Really, maybe a new defensive coordinator will give him more snaps and get more out of him, because I think the sky's the limit for him. Freddie Swain has established himself as a pretty solid number 3 receiver. Then you look at 2020, and Trey Brown looked every bit the part of starting cornerback and dynamic playmaker in this league before his injury. And hopefully he comes back from that patella tendon injury 100%. Even D. Eskridge, I tend to be of the camp that, well, that shouldn't have been the pick in the 2nd round. How good would it have been to have Creed Humphrey instead as a Pro Bowl center, as a rookie, who's taking 5 or 6 spots behind him, instead of a guy that's kind of redundant with other stuff they have on the roster. But that being said, he looks like a dynamic player who could have a big role on this team moving forward. And then we still don't know what we're going to get out of Stone Forsythe, the 6th round pick. They think he could be the left tackle of the future. And they're still very high on him as well. So only 3 picks last year, but still, some things look to be potentially getting better in that talent evaluation area of the front office. Now, what more do I think needs to be done? We got to talk about Bobby Wagner. 1 year left on his deal, just over $20 million. Very little of it's guaranteed. Only $3.7 million in dead cap money if you were to cut him. So a little over $16 million cap savings, which could get your cap space up to the $70 million neighborhood. That is significant, would allow you to do anything you want to do. And when you see, even though he set the tackles record this year and led the NFL in tackles, or would have if he wouldn't have gotten hurt in that last week, the consensus seems to be, again, from people I trust who evaluate NFL players, the consensus seems to be that the athletic decline was so significant this year that part of why the Seahawks had to play such a passive scheme, had to play 8 in coverage sometimes, had to play back, play that bend but don't break, was to cover up for Bobby's limitations. I saw Bobby Wagner on Saturday night. I waited on he and his day. I know he's coming off a recent knee injury, but he did not look right. He was not walking like a guy who's ready to run through a brick wall and go be an all-pro for the 9th year in a row. Bill Belichick has always said it's better to move on from a player too soon than too late. I'll say this about Bobby Wagner. There may be a window of opportunity if he's willing to restructure his deal, or if the Seahawks cut him, he doesn't find what he likes in the free agent market, and then he comes back. There's no way that they do nothing and just let him come back and play for $20 million in 2022. There's no way that happens. Look what they did with KJ Wright last year. They let him test free agency. They were open to bringing him back, but then ultimately with some of the other things that were happening on their roster, they decided not to. When you look at how well Jordan Brooks played this year, then the question then would be, does he move over to middle linebacker and take that spot for Bobby? Or is it Cody Barton, who had some deficiencies in the last couple of games, had a couple of plays he wished he could have over again, but for the most part played really well. And then you hear Carroll's comments about how he wants to be more of an attacking style defense. That doesn't fit with what they had to do this year to cover up for Bobby Wagner's drop in quickness and athleticism. And I don't think that's going to get any better. For the last 2 years, maybe 3, if you recall, a week or 2 before the opener in each of the last couple of years, Bobby's had to go overseas and get that injection. The platelet-rich injection in his knee could be a degenerative situation. So it'd be a sad day when Bobby Wagner's not a Seahawk anymore. I got to see it firsthand Saturday night. His reputation precedes him, and it's accurate. Just one of the nicest, most classy, tactful guys I've ever seen, especially who does what he does for a living and makes the kind of money he makes. Just a fantastic person and one of the great Seahawks of all time. He may have played his last game in Seattle. I suspect he has. Now, speaking of playing your last game in Seattle, the Russell Wilson talk has started already. But here's the thing, and you've heard me play into it, and I will too, this offseason. If he opens the door, if he does anything similar to what he did last year by going on the Dan Patrick show and talking about how he was open to moving on, then we could see something happen. I told you I'd put a number on it. I would say it's 80-20 that he comes back. And if you're asking yourself, why so little? Like, why isn't it 90-10 or 95-5 or 100-0? It's because what happened last year, as much as so many of you fans want to be in denial about it, really happened. It was legitimate, and it was run by him and his agent. And I happen to know on good authority that John Schneider reached a point last offseason where he was so angry with how Russell Wilson's agent, Mark Rodgers, was handling all of that and driving that narrative, that he was willing to entertain the idea of trading Russell Wilson. So where do I think they're at today? With the report a few days ago from Ian Rappaport that Wilson wants to explore his options. And then Jake Heaps, who knows Russell Wilson about as well as anyone, runs his camps for him. He's been called his personal quarterback coach. Says Russell told him it's not true. There was enough to it behind the scenes last year to know that the tension was real. The tension was real. Let me put it this way. A high-ranking football official with another team told someone that I know and trust very well that it was real. And there was a moment where the two sides were butting heads hard, and the Seahawks there was a non-zero chance, as Jason Churchill would say, that Wilson was going to get traded. If he lets this linger, this is why I've left 20%. Because if Wilson doesn't just shut the door on all of this early in the offseason, it's only going to get worse. And I'll talk about, if that's the case, I'll come on the show and I'll have guests on, and we'll talk about speculative deals and mock drafts and stuff. And we'll have fun with it just because that's the offseason and that's what you talk about. It's fun to think about stuff like that. But the time doesn't make sense. I think this time next year is when you legitimately think about whether or not you need to trade Russell Wilson, because then you're a year away from his deal expiring. That's when he's going to want to get signed. He may put pressure on the team to sign him before he steps on the field next year. Obviously, you're not going to get back as much in return, but at that time, then the question becomes, do we want to sign him to a fourth contract for that kind of money? But now, Russell Wilson says he wants to win. His best chance of winning is to come back, because I've just outlined all the reasons why this team could be in really good shape heading into 2022. They need to have a good offseason. What NFL team doesn't, in order to maintain or achieve contender status? But they have the resources to do it. And that's why this is going to be such a fun offseason to cover. So I think that kind of sets the stage, right? Kind of recap the season, where they stand, where things stand personnel-wise, and now we can get on with the business of the offseason. Obviously, they have to hire a defensive coordinator, and then we'll start talking draft. Free agency first. That'll start in March. That'll be here before you know it. We'll have the Combine coming up, the Senior Bowl in a week or two, and we'll dive into some draft stuff. Thanks for joining me again. It's good to be back. I feel like all the technical stuff worked. So hopefully it did on your end if you're watching the live stream. Join me for the next show. It'll be episode 30 of the ECS. And, as long as baseball is going to be in a lockdown, then all we have to talk about is Seahawks football. And so what happens with them as we get closer to the Combine and free agency will dictate how often I hop on and do a show and get some of my favorite guests on here. So again, if you don't follow me on Twitter, it's @SeahawksForever. Whichever podcast platform you're listening to the show on, please subscribe so you get notification of new episodes. Please like it. If you can leave a review, that would be great and really help the show out a lot. Until next time, I am Dan Viens. This is the Emerald City Sportscast. See you next time.